Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Matt.
We'll resume the Planning Commission meeting for October 14th. And Mr. Minsmer, would you introduce our new Planning Commission member again for the public?
Absolutely, Mr. McKenzie. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to welcome Linda Martin. Linda Martin is filling the position that was left open by Ms. Dahl. And Ms. Martin comes to us with an education background and as a past planning commissioner with the City of Monroe. And so we're looking forward to her experience in both arenas. Thank you for joining us.
And any news about the 7th position?
As Mr. Mount has resigned the commission, and there will be an appointment before the City Council on the 26th of October. And so at our next meeting, I'll be able to introduce that person, hopefully.
Thank you very much. Okay, any other news? If not, we'll proceed with the presentation and discussion of the Shoreline Master Program Periodic Update Draft Amendments. Ms. Grage, I believe you're on.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all. The last time that the Commission was together to talk about the Shoreline Master Program Periodic Update was August 26th, 2020. So we've had a little bit of time that's gone by since that discussion. You'll recall that during that meeting, Alex Capron and Dan Nickel with the Watershed Company were with us to lead us through and kind of talk about the proposed initial draft amendments to the Shoreline Master Program. And this evening, we'd like to continue that discussion. We again have Dan Nickel and Alex Capron who will guide us through part 2 of our draft amendments review and discussion. And with that, I will introduce Alex to give the presentation. Hi, Alex.
Hello. All right. Thank you, Libby. I'll share my screen here. All right. So with that, the second meeting to discuss the initial draft of the amendments to the SMP. Here's part of this periodic update. So yeah, this discussion is going to follow the gap analysis document that was originally provided to the Planning Commission. And the format of the meeting will provide code excerpts and discuss reasons and background for why that change was being made. And then the topic areas here, so there'll be a code discussion as well as a continued discussion on the Cannery Shoreline Environment Designation. So to start, we'll talk about building height, aligning with the zoning code, as well as vegetation conservation standards, so preserving existing canopy while permitting tree trimming and redevelopment activities. The dock and pier regulations have to do with what elements constitute repair versus replacement. The percent slope calculation, we'll kind of walk through that as well. That has to do with limiting impervious surfaces within the Conservancy and Shoreline Residential designation. And then we'll also talk about the prioritized restoration plan memo that we prepared, and then a potential amendment addendum to the cumulative impacts analysis. So the building height change really stems from the SMP originally having the building height regulations within the definition section of the SMP. And so by relocating these outside to section 5.12, so this is the use and modification matrix and development standards section of the SMP, we're also able to bring over some of the zoning code updates that took place fairly recently. And so these first sections have to do with average natural grade. And yeah, this is continuing from the regulations on the previous page. So this has to do with, again, calculating building height. So taking the midpoint of each wall, and it also takes into account the final grading after recording of final plat. So again, these are regulations that have occurred within the zoning code. Then the one carryover from the SMP is that subsection E there. So for overwater structures, the ordinary high water mark to the top end, the highest point of that structure is the way to calculate height. Yeah, so these regulations aren't really changing per se. It's more of a carryover from zoning code and relocation. And yeah, the final changes here to the building height have to do with the exceptions. So that is basically any structure or a pertinent part of the structure, like a chimney or stairwell or elevator shaft. These are all elements that can extend above the height restriction within the zone. And then that Roman numeral 4 talks about mixed use and industrial zones. So that wasn't originally within the SMP. So that is carried over from the zoning code to reference uses there. And the final amendment with the building height has to do with buildings that exceed the height limitations as part of the Shoreline Management Act. So the Shoreline Management Act, and particularly the RCW section that's listed there, 90.58.320 talks about view preservation. So for any building that exceeds 35 feet, there is a view corridor analysis that has to take place. And that's just documenting that a significant number of properties don't have view obstructions as part of that development. Yeah, so that's the cause there for that change. So you'll see just within the table there, it talks about that would really be within urban maritime, and then other areas per the zoning that go above the 35 feet. Moving on to vegetation conservation standards. This is really aimed at being more prescriptive to better account for known loss of shoreline ecological function. So shoreline vegetation is very valuable for the shoreline ecology. And the intent of these changes is to create clear limits, and some, where there weren't really limits per se. So this change here is the standards for subdivisions that any removal can only be up to 25% of the shoreline linear length for a subdivision. And that's carrying out the existing regulation that talks about redevelopment earlier in the section of this code excerpt. So for vegetation, for tree trimming activities, this will now, the proposal is to require a shoreline exemption for any of these activities, and to firm up the crown removal of allowing 25% of the crown, so 75% crown retention. And this is similar amongst other jurisdictions. Island County is one example. And so we walked through kind of what the tree trimming activity looks like, and so it's very clear for the applicant what they need to supply the city to have a tree trimming activity occur. And then in terms of tree trimming activities within a critical area, that if an activity is occurring within that critical area, it would need a qualified professional to demonstrate that there isn't any adverse impacts, be it a wetland, a steep slope, because they do provide, the canopy and whatnot provide beneficial a high ecological value. And so to ensure that the tree trimming activities occur per the plan that the applicant provides, there is a pre and post as-built photo. So marking the limbs that they're proposed for removal, and even prior to that it's ensuring that the trimming is for view preservation, not view creation. And this is consistent with the city's inventory and characterization report, which is one of the supplemental reports to the SMP. So this took a snapshot of vegetation and resources along the shoreline, so that we're not allowing more impacts to the shoreline with that. Now there is a recognition for private property rights, so if you do have hazardous trees, that a tree assessment could be done by a qualified professional to remove that tree. So there are instances there for the health and safety and property there. The emphasis here on handheld equipment versus ground-based motorized equipment. So city is encouraging low-impact techniques, and so what that means is if you're using handheld equipment, it's a preference, just an overall less site disturbance, less noise, so less nuisance for neighboring property owners, and with that, if that is what the applicant chooses to go with, they would be able to prepare their own plan instead of a professionally drawn plan. So that is an option when there is a permitted clearing activity that's taking place. And then finally, when there is clearing activity, treating the vegetation conservation area similar to what you'd need to do for any kind of mitigation within a critical area, that the development director has the option to use bonding as a mechanism to ensure success of those plantings as they are planted and then as they get established. So that is an option. And then also updating the codes that are currently in play for the city. So that's the clearing and grading regulations and the stormwater. So regarding dock and pier repair, so currently the SMP doesn't have a definition for substructure. So when an applicant comes in for repair, it's hard to administer. What is this? What does it mean? So by providing a definition for substructure, that it is all the composite elements of the pier except for the pier pile. If someone's coming in for repair, and maybe that pier is non-conforming in some way, maybe the size is over the threshold, or it's within the setback. This does allow that property owner to continue that pier to a limited extent. So that is basically the allowance there. It's a little more black and white than it was before the definition was introduced. So regarding the percent slope clarification, I guess just to back up. So the percent slope is a mechanism for limiting impervious surface, the way it's established now. So the greater the slope, the smaller the amount of impervious surface allowed within the shoreline residential and conservancy designations. So it was unclear to the applicant and city staff if that included the bluff areas, which is really where this applies along the Glamis Channel. And so by adding this clarification, and I'll move to the next slide here. So this graphic kind of shows that the text and the code changes will allow impervious surface, or the percent slope calculation be beyond the bluff, but it will only apply within shoreline jurisdiction. So when you're doing an impervious surface calculation, you don't include anything waterward of the ordinary high water mark. You also, you're not including the bluff. So this is really intending to limit the amount of impervious surface within shoreline jurisdiction, because it's lot coverage and impervious surface maximums aren't really a recognized regulation citywide. It's just within the SMP and shoreline jurisdiction. So if there's slope beyond the bluff, then that would limit it, but it clarifies that it doesn't count the bluff in that calculation. So moving on to the cannery discussion. So this is a continuation from the last meeting. So the issue here is really an inconsistency with the urban shoreline environment designation and the underlying zoning. So the zoning graphic there that's shows an R2 zoning and then an Old Town R3 zoning. So residential zoning, and then the overlay, the shoreline environment designation of urban, which is a little more permissive in types of uses. So the zoning is more restrictive. And so if a development application came in, the restriction would lie with the zoning as the most restrictive regulation. So that is one issue that's at play. So anything waterward of the ordinary high water mark, that is aquatic and it's light manufacturing. So that is not at question here. So along with the inconsistency with zoning and shoreline environment designation are the lot constraints. So both canneries are part of these really narrow lots that makes meeting setbacks and other development standards difficult, as well as the topography of this site. On the cannery to the west has very steep slopes, and also with parking issues at play, given the size of these lots for any kind of development activities, it would not have enough room for parking necessarily the way the lot is configured. So the city's vision includes completing the Glamis Island Trail, and this is allowed in both the shoreline residential and urban shoreline environment designations. And it's supported by the recreational element of the SMP, which encourages acquiring these types of sites through easement, through purchase. So that future use activity and goal long term is not finding conflict with either shoreline environment designation. And really the final cannery slide really talks about the applicability of the urban shoreline environment designation, that It's appropriate for areas that currently support or are planned for commercial or industrial development. This is planned for neither of those uses, so it does contradict the current zoning. So it would be a series of hurdles to change this around. It would be a rezone. There would be some changes here that would have to occur for this shoreline environment designation to remain as is. So, with that, if there's any discussion by Planning Commission at this time, I can continue to move on. But it is a complicated issue, given the neighboring use of the cannery that may potentially be. Hearing none, I will continue to move forward. So the amendments to the SMP restoration plan. This included a technical memo that was used by where we conducted interviews with city staff, various agencies in the port to ensure that projects were up to date. Projects that were completed were noted as such, and then to create kind of a high-level weight-based model and create future prioritization for types of projects. So the model is based on cost and ecological value. So the items with the highest value, lowest cost for conservation easements. These would promote protection of these resources in perpetuity. So that is a good first step, but it's helping decision makers with this process at a high level. So as projects and project funding comes to be, this is just another tool to refer to. And finally, with the cumulative impacts addendum. So this is looking at potential impacts, that the city may foresee based on our capital improvement project. And one that was identified as a possibility is a future need for a combined sewer outfall facility. So the way a cumulative impacts addendum would work is we would look at hydrology, water quality, and habitat, and ensure that there are no cumulative impacts or that they're properly mitigated for. So that addendum would be something that would happen after the joint public comment period, but it would kind of spell out what those changes would be and how that would take place. All right, and looking at the timeline, so we're here October 14th. So we're moving toward the joint public hearing and public comment period with Department of Ecology. So they would prepare their notices as well and open up that comment period. And that would begin in about a month with the joint public hearing on December 9th. And with that, after that comment period closed in mid-December, we would have 30 days to respond to the public comments and provide those comments to Planning Commission and make the changes necessary to the SMP that would need to happen based upon comments and submit to Ecology for their initial determination, the changes to the SMP. So this initial determination isn't a finality, but any changes that Ecology would recommend would then come back and we would respond to them in a matrix and provide the necessary changes. So moving towards adoption in the spring. And with that, I will hand it back to Libby and Don. Thank you very much.
Do the commissioners have any questions at this point? I will confess my level of ignorance on a couple of these areas, and I'd like perhaps a little more clarification. Can you talk more about the urban designation and the balancing between the urban designation and the local zoning? What are the conflicts for the people holding land within that area? And I'm not sure who's the best person to respond to that.
Well, I can do that, Mr. Chair. This is Libby. So some of the potential conflicts between the environment designation and the zoning are the types of uses that are allowed. So as the urban designation indicates, there are more urban commercial type uses allowed within that shoreline environment designation, whereas the underlying R2 zone is a low density residential zone, allowing for primarily residential uses. There are also conflicts in terms of the form and intensity standards, building heights, setbacks, that sort of thing. So a few different areas we're talking about in terms of conflicts.
So if I could extend the question a little bit then, at the present time, which ordinance would supersede in terms of land use and opportunities for the owners to make use of the land they have there? Which zoning wins? Yeah, so typically what we see is that the most restrictive regulation or protective of the environment would control. And so most likely it would be the zoning R2, which would control what could happen in those areas. And I think we should make this clear for during the public meeting, that because I assume there may be some people with a stake in the matter here. I had one other question, if I may. Oh, Mr. Meismer, you had more to add?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So our thought is, and Libby, I apologize for jumping in on this, but our thought is that what we'd like to do is put together a little white paper on that particular area, along with probably 3 or 4 subjects, and have that available for the Planning Commission and the public to more thoroughly understand the complexities of what we're talking about there.
Thank you. I think that makes good sense. And I had one other question. Oh, Mr. Graff.
Go ahead, Ward. I'll wait for you.
The other question I had to do with the conservation easement. Can you explain more of the nature of that conservation easement? Where is it, and how is that implemented? It gives a general area, but how close to the water is this easement, and what does it involve?
Right. Yeah. So the two conservation easements that were originally identified in the 2010 restoration plan were along the Glamis Channel and the East Ship Harbor Conservation, and then the southeast side of March Point. And yeah, I don't have graphics of those available and to what extent those would be, but that is certainly something we could look into.
So, Mr. Chair,
Mr. Meismer,
I'd recommend that we go ahead and put together a graphic on that.
I think that would be very helpful, especially for the public meeting.
Absolutely, thank you.
Mr. Graff, you had an earlier question?
I do, just for clarification, and I'm not sure if Alex or Mr. Meismer and staff is going to be the best to answer this, but going back to the vegetation and the tree trimming section, there was a lot of red ink there. Was that, I'm assuming those are additions or changes to the current, and did those come from the recent developmental codes that we just updated? Is this all verbatim from those that have been brought over to the SMP?
Go ahead, Libby.
Thank you. No, these are not items that are in the development regulation. There are some of these aspects would be within the critical areas regulations as far as, limits on trimming and slope hazard areas and that sort of thing. But these are not moved over. These are in the SMP only.
Okay, so these are new items. It's not a consolidation of bringing other items over from different codes?
Correct.
Is there, so the reason why I'm asking this is for those neighborhoods and those HOAs that live along shorelines where there's root view properties and there's constantly, the request to trim, whether it's private property trees or public property trees to maintain those views. Is there going to be anything here that may cause some concern of those property owners, more restrictive or no change in current policy? Good answer.
That's something that probably want to look at and speak with the city attorney potentially to kind of identify what those issues might be. Do you have anything to add to that, Don? Or?
Yes, thank you. So it is a little bit more restrictive, yes. What we have found over the years is that the current SMP allows for some trimming, but there's really no oversight. There's no permitting criteria. And so folks will go trim, and then we find out about it afterwards, and they've not quite followed the criteria for windowing for views in the current SMP. This language anticipates trimming trees for view corridors and so forth, but does put limits on it that provides protection for forage fish along the shoreline, and also provides protection for those geologically hazardous areas, the bluffs, et cetera, along the shorelines.
Okay, and that'll all be delineated in this. Are we just, the words that we see in paragraph D and E, is that really it? Or is it going to be a little more, I thought that the pier repair, was very specific about 50%. If it appears to be more than 50% over a 3-year period, then it really needs a review. But in this case, it's going to be clear if you're requesting to trim trees to maintain your view, then you need to come to the city to get approval of that. Is that how that process will work?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
I had a related thought under there's a requirement to plant a native conifer, a single native conifer in an area where it's being restored. Is that correct? Did I read that wrong? It just seemed like a curious, almost a non sequitur to me.
And I apologize. I don't have that section in front of me today.
Alex, I think if you go back a slide or forward a slide, it's on letter G. Go back. Yep, there you go. Right where your mouse is, including a minimum of 1 native conifer within the shoreline setback.
Right. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's, with any kind of shoreline restoration, or if there's clearing that's happening, that at least one tree be planted. So that is kind of a minimum standard, so you're not just doing clearing and then there's no tree that is coming back as part of that.
The reason I raised that question is maybe my knowledge isn't all that good, but it seems like individual conifers don't usually thrive very well. Don't they do better planted in groups? And does this add trees where there weren't any before that might create even more problems for people who are upland of the shoreline area?
No, that's a good point, and it's certainly something we can look at. I think part of this is taking some model language from other jurisdictions. I mean, there are jurisdictions that are looking to restore the shoreline to some degree, and this is a minimum step above that. But yeah, I mean, there's two sides to that coin. If that standard's removed and maybe that ground cover doesn't do as well, that's.
So I didn't mean to belabor the point. It just seems like it was sort of sandwiched in there, and perhaps we need to tease that out for the public hearing. That what is the impact of this kind of requirement? And I apologize to other commissioners. I sort of took a lot of time here. Do other people have questions or issues that they would like addressed at this time?
Mr. Chair, I was wondering, when we do this review with the folks, would it be good to have a model, not a built model, but a visual model of an existing property on the shoreline that wanted to make adjustments, tree trimming, changing vegetation, changing the impervious, expanding or decreasing the impervious surface area. And then another model and what would be the requirements then? What they could do, what was a minimum requirement? And the same thing on a brand new site, building site, not an existing house, but a house that was going to be built by a bluff or whatever, and what criteria was there. So you turn this into a visual discussion, have a visual discussion somehow. And Libby, going back to when you were showing a variety of a number of the different we had two developments that we were talking about, and you did a good job of putting in perspective where the new building development would be, oriented the audience to it, so you could figure out what you were talking about. Would that be of help to the future audience so they get an idea? If you were buying a home existing or you're going to build a home, these are, and you fall within shoreline, this is the minimum criteria that you have to consider. Looking at it from a user's perspective.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. At a staff level, I absolutely agree that coming up with some graphic educational materials for permit applicants to specifically show, like as you say, illustrate, examples of what the requirements are I think that is a great idea, and I would love to do that. As far as producing something for the public hearing, as far as illustrating some of these things, I'd like to get some feedback from Alex on his thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think maybe something simple that is hand-drawn might be a possibility, because I think it's very easily, it's something that you can discuss visually. I don't think we would have enough time to prepare something that is a graphic that's been prepared by like one of our designers per se.
Well, Alex, this is Mike again. What if we did a before and after type on just a before and after pic on a new build, and an exemplary example of an existing property that made some changes that met the requirement. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Courtwright, are you speaking specifically about the trimming language that we have up on the screen?
Trimming language, the vegetation language, the impervious.
Yes.
Those three areas and the planting of the vegetation. Yes. Something to cover all of those. Is it possible?
I think it's possible. I think, the level of detail and artistic ability on staff's behalf is questionable, but we can see if we can put something together within a reasonable amount of time that might help folks understand what these requirements are talking about. We can take a look at that.
Okay. Thank you.
I think that's a great suggestion. It's in reading through this, even if someone is fairly knowledgeable about the shoreline management protections, it gets into a level of detail that you get lost in the shuffle here. And anything we can do to clarify and make simple the changes that are being proposed, I think would be very helpful.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Dretsky.
Actually, it's probably a question for staff. Can you highlight the major differences between this proposal and what the permit process has required over the last 3 to 4 years? What are the real major things besides the trimming part and maybe some of the vegetation questions? But as far as building size and setbacks, are there any major changes that are being implemented here?
Just overall, in general,
Right.
Not in terms of building heights. No, there are no changes there. No setback changes. For the most part, the changes are, primarily to address changes that have occurred in legislation, state law, just to bring our SMP up to the current requirements in terms of that, and also identifying just areas where staff has had a hard time administering certain sections to try and clarify issues. But, Alex, you can add in here, but I don't, think that there's anything major other than, there are a couple of the shoreline environment designation changes. I think those are, something that we'll have to talk about more.
I guess my question is more in line with the current property owner who wants to build a proposed home. What this is going to require, again, typical, as far as limitations on size, lot coverage, that type of thing. Is it going to increase the cost, minimize the size of the house over the existing or the old regime for permits?
I don't think there aren't any changes to the form and intensity standards for building in the shoreline. Okay.
Can we go back to the slide that I think had the outfall on it, because it really kind of addresses the question I want to ask. Another question, if you'll
Yep.
allow me that.
Alex, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you zeroed in on it. Yeah, there aren't any major changes. The percent slope is an issue that's just it's making it easier for staff to administer, and it wasn't clear. It's not making it any more burdensome. And in fact, there's a way you could interpret the code that would be very burdensome today that kind of clears that up.
Good, okay.
Yeah, eliminating.
Currently, pretty much where you've got B on this aerial photograph, to the cannery, which was the western of the two canneries that you showed in the previous slide, that's privately held property. That's the access to the cannery. The cannery actually doesn't touch the ground at all. I think it's all, the entire cannery is built on piers. Nothing changes there, regardless of what we do as far as going forward, right? That's all grandfathered in? I guess that's the question.
As far as existing structures?
Yeah, well, it leads to the question of the Guimas Trail someday coming through. That would be where it would go. But I guess as long as the property is privately held and utilized to access that cannery, that'll never be part of the Guimas Trail. Is that correct?
Don, do you have an answer to that?
Thank you, Frank, Mr. Chair. So let's talk about that a little bit. We would hope that over the years, whomever owns that property would grant an easement for Guaymas Channel Trail, and then we would be able to go through all the permits necessary to build that trail in that area. We don't know exactly where the trail would lay within that area, but we have a good idea. So
the property could be jointly used for the commercial endeavor that's there now and the public usage.
That's correct.
That's a possibility. Okay.
That's a possibility. So, and this is also in that area where we have some conflicts with the abutting residential uses, the urban designation, the R2 zone, and the Old Town area. So we're going to put together some information on that to describe what those conflicts would be based on urban, based on LM zoning, based on R2, and based on Old Town zoning. So you'll have that in front of you for an upcoming meeting.
And you're going to come up with something that satisfies everybody?
Yeah, right. Well, we're going to...
I'm kidding.
We're going to try to have a couple of alternatives for the public to consider.
All right.
Don,
also... thank you for letting me humor you.
Yeah. Well, we're anticipating some public comment on that potentially would help us find some alternatives.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, some great questions, and I think we have some direction here for the public meeting that'll help bring out some good discussion. Are there any other issues or questions for the commissioners? Any last-minute additions from the staff or the consultants? Nothing being offered, I propose that we close the meeting and thank everybody for their participation. We look forward to the white paper.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Goodbye.